Today's video is really one of the heaviest subjects I've ever done. It required a tremendous amount of research and more forethought than an ordinary financial video would require. Hi, I'm John McNeil. This is the Invest Strong Network. Welcome. Today, we will be talking about reparations. Now, that is an explosive term in the United States of America, and rightfully so. Our history is one of tremendous success in freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, but it is also one filled with certain iniquities that have tremendously burdened and punished certain members of our communities. All right. Now, this video will run a little bit longer than my normal vids would, but I think it'll be well worth sticking until the very end. Okay, so the word reparation has taken on the political connotation of, in some quarters, of taking from one individual or group and giving to another individual or group. And yes, obviously some redistribution is in fact a part of what makes something a reparation. However, when one examines the word in its entirety, the real meaning of a reparation means to repair, right? Now, in order for something to be repaired, it has to be broken in the first place, right? And so the biggest hurdle that some persons have when it comes to accepting the idea of a reparation or reparation program is the idea that the current system is not working properly. And for that system to be corrected. And of course, when you are the person or the group that is in power, right? You don't want people telling you that your system is not equitable, right? But we'll get further into that a bit later in the vid. So, as it relates to Black Americans, the idea of reparations has really been around since the end of the Civil War, and rightfully so. You had over 4 million Black persons, former slaves that had been busted free by the victory of the Union in the Civil War. But these persons, although they had an amount of political and legal freedom, they did not have very much economic wealth to fall back on. So the idea from the very beginning was to construct a repertory program that could, shall we say, ascend the former slaves, perhaps not on parity with whites, but certainly lift them out of the dire poverty that most of them were dropped into by emancipation. All right. Now, there are several templates that we could use to measure an effective reparations program. Now, in the 20th century, for instance, we have the example of Germany. Now, obviously, during the Nazi years, they had tremendous anti-Jewish, anti-Gypsy, other programs that basically ripped asunder certain ethnicities to the tune of millions of deaths and stripping persons of rights and dignities that were really outrageous even for the time, certainly outrageous in a 21st century standpoint. Now, a successive number of German governments decided to do what was right. And really, the Nazi regime was never popular in the first place, but certainly the post-Nazi regime understood that there was a heavy burden of responsibility for what the Nazi regime was allowed to do. And so they constructed a reparations program that basically amounted to seeding the nation of Israel with enormous amounts of money, right, wealth, and that allowed for a Jewish homeland to be established and actually flourish to a large degree, and is with us to this very day, and perhaps for many years in the future. So that's one model of reparations. Another model of reparation is what the Canadian government did for the First Nations people, or what we would call in the United States of America, the Native Americans. So obviously, similar to what happened in the United States of America, many of the First Nations people were pushed off their ancestral lands. Many of them suffered dire poverty and disease by coming into contact with European explorers and military personnel and whatnot. And so at some point, the Canadian government understood that they carried a heavy responsibility of guilt. And so in addition to issuing an official apology to many of the First Nations tribes that were disenfranchised by the growth of what we would call modern Canada, they also did monetary reparations to help seed economic development in many First Nations lands. Okay, so that's a second model of reparation. Now, the model of reparations that we are perhaps most familiar with here in the United States of America is the reparations that were paid to the Japanese Americans for their internment during the Second World War. So obviously, if you're familiar with American history, over 100,000 persons of Japanese descent, mostly on the West Coast, but actually throughout the West and central part of the country, were basically rounded up by the U.S. government and kept in internment camps under fear that they may in some way collaborate with the Japanese government in Tokyo after the Pearl Harbor attacks. Now, much to the credit of the Roosevelt administration, although they were the ones who really began this thing in the first place in 1942, they come to realize the falsity of what they were doing actually in the middle of the war. So by 1944, they come to the realization that this was a terrible idea, that these people were completely innocent, and that this system of interning innocent, mostly American people needed to be disbanded, right? And it was disbanded in the middle of the Second World War. And in fact, the war would rage on for almost 16 more months before 16 months after the breaking up of the internment camps. So give them credit for that, right? They did not wait till the war was over and then try to do some kind of retrospective or something like that. They did not. They ended it during they admitted their mistakes and ended it during the campaign itself. Very impressive. Now, the actual payment of the reparations actually took some 4 decades later. And it was the Reagan administration in the 1980s that finally decided that they needed to make right what had been made wrong. And some 82,000 remaining survivors from the internment and their immediate descendants were paid the amount of $20,000 apiece, along with an official letter of apology from the federal government, the American government, for the internment, right? And really, to a large degree, that was an atonement, right? And I think even many Japanese Americans who certainly lost more than $20,000 during the 2.5 years or so of their internment, but they would admit that this was a magnanimous thing for the government of the United States of America to do, especially when this whole system came in the middle of this apocalyptic world war that the country was involved in, right? Okay, so those are the models that we have to work on. Now, as it relates to Black Americans, a reparations program would be perhaps a combination of all of these things and then others added on top, right? Obviously, the ancestors or descendants rather of slaves make up an order of magnitude larger than those of the Japanese internment. So whereas about 100,000 Americans were interned during the Second World War, we have the number of descendants of slaves in North America, United States of America in particular, that's over many tens of millions, right? So any kind of reparations program would have to be very diverse and very complex in its structure to reach all of them. Now, after looking at it personally and examining this thing, and yes, I'm obviously a Black American, and yes, a descendant of slaves myself, I take a personal interest in this, right? And the conclusion that I have come to is that a reparations program, a reparatory program for Black Americans would have to be something on the line of President Roosevelt's New Deal program from the 1930s to fight the Depression, right? That's the conclusion I've come to. So reparations would have to be on a political level, a legal level, a social level, an educational level, a medical level, and an economic level in order for true reparations to be paid and be effective. Well, how would this look? Well, this is what I have come to after studying this. On a political level, reparations would look something like this. The federal government, perhaps even the White House, but perhaps by an act of Congress, would issue an official letter of apology for the institution of slavery to begin with, and also the toleration of slavery, and for the allowance of these Jim Crow or segregation apartheid laws that existed for some 100 years after the Civil War. Number one. Number two, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico would be granted statehood. Now, for me, that looking at it from a political standpoint, that allows for more equity in the Senate in particular. As DC is a majority Black area, if it can obtain statehood, you could put 2 senators, probably Black, to the Senate and 1 more congressperson. Puerto Rico would send 2 senators, either Hispanic or Afro-Hispanic or both, to the Senate, and also probably 3 or perhaps even 4 representatives to the House, right? And that would create more equality, be it right now in 2020, you have only 3 Blacks that make up the Senate, when in fact Black Americans make up some 13% of the population. Clearly something not right there. And so this would be a way of repairing that. And in addition, it would provide for a full enfranchisement of some 4 million additional people that are already American citizens. They could be fully enfranchised by making DC and also Puerto Rico states. So that would be number 2. Also, for states that mandate photo IDs for voting, all states would be required by law to provide free photo IDs to all eligible voters, right? All eligible voters. So if they are mandated to have a photo ID, the state is mandated to provide it for them free of charge, right? That would be a reparation, right? And by the way, they would set up offices in those communities, underserved Black minority communities. They would set up offices in those communities where the photo IDs can be acquired for free, right? All right. Also, voting rights would be returned automatically to all persons who have completed criminal sentences. So in some states, mostly in the South, you have a situation where voting rights are lost upon conviction of a crime, and then one has to make some kind of elaborate petition to a state agency or to the governor to get their voting rights back. This has the effect of tremendously disenfranchising large numbers of Black and Hispanic people who have felony convictions on their records. A reparation to that would be the immediate and automatic return of voting rights once a sentence is completed. No questions asked, no need to further petition. All right. Also, there would be, on a state level, qualified addresses that would be set up for the homeless. So if a homeless person wishes to vote and they have the legal eligibility to vote, then the fact that they do not have a residential address would not prevent them from doing that. The government would set up an address of record. It could be a government office or something like that, and that would be their address of record, and that would allow them to vote legally as they should be as a citizen. That would be a reparation, a repair. All right. Now, then there's the very heavy aspect of the legal reparations. Now, there's so much about our legal system that needs to be repaired. I'd almost have to do an entire video just on that. But here are some high points that I think should be taken into consideration. First of all, an independent constitutional rights panel would investigate every accusation of excessive force or profiling that is lodged against a law enforcement agency. An independent panel will do that, right? And at the end of their investigation, they will publish a report, and in that report, it could either completely free the agency, or it will detail how things need to be improved. And also, this agency would have the responsibility of meting out discipline and or perhaps even prosecution to the offending agencies or officers, right? No more internal affairs departments, no more grand juries with their opaque structure, none of that. No, this is a public investigation, and this would go a very long way towards repairing a serious rift in the legal system. Also, every police agency would be required to keep and maintain detailed racial records on their voluntary contacts with all citizenry. So if an officer or an agency, if they contact you for any reason, right, they have to record that your ethnicity, keep it in their records for review or investigation at some later time. See, there are many agencies that do not do that right now, right? And so it's very difficult to find if they are actually profiling and doing things like that, which is, again, creates a rift in minority communities. That would be eliminated. Also, the capital punishment would be abolished on a national level. No more death penalty. Every research, every statistic I have ever seen on capital punishment comes to one inescapable conclusion: that Blacks, Hispanics, and the poor are disproportionately targeted for capital punishment. And that's in every state, every jurisdiction. That's a fact, right? And that has to stop, right? So there would be perhaps even an amendment to the Constitution which abolishes capital punishment and replace it with perhaps a life in prison system without parole, right? That would be another reparation. And then there would be the war on drugs, and we'll put war on drugs in air quotes, would be refocused on decriminalizing small portions of drugs designed for personal consumption, and would be redirected towards treatment for those persons who are seeking to break free of their addiction. Treatment instead of punishment via the criminal justice system. Also, every citizen, every person must be given access to rights counsel during any police interaction. So if you're driving along a highway or street or whatever, you're pulled over by the police and an officer wants you to step out of the vehicle, or they want to search your vehicle, or they want to do something, and you're not a lawyer, you don't know the interactions between or the intersection between constitutional law and state statute and case law and all of that stuff, and you don't know where your rights end and their rights begin, you would then, by law, have access to telephonically contact a rights attorney that will give you instruction and counsel on exactly what an officer can do, what they cannot do, and if the officer insists on doing a particular action, you can then hand your phone to that officer, and they can receive that counsel directly from the rights counselor. And at that point, if they decide to go on and do what they want to do anyway, then they can immediately be prosecuted for an obstruction of justice. Right. If they intentionally violate your rights after having been instructed and counseled otherwise. That would be a reparation to the current system. All right. Also, each and every officer would be required to complete mandatory training and advanced training to handle the mentally ill and mentally impaired, right? So many of the victims of police violence and unnecessary deaths are persons with mental illness and officers who really are not trained to handle them. And many of those people are Black, right? And desperately poor. And this would be a reparation to that system. Okay. And then I think perhaps one of the most important aspects of the legal structure is, instead of courts issuing warrants for failure to appear in court or failure to pay a ticket or something like that, then the courts would now be, if you fail to show up in court or you fail to pay a ticket or whatnot, the court can be empowered to garnish your wages or even garnish your Social Security benefits in lieu of issuing a warrant, right? And that would be, to me, that's a much better way of handling a situation than having millions of people walking around with warrants so that they're ready to be pounced on by a law enforcement agency at any time. That would be another legal reparation. Now, on an educational level, a reparation would look something like this. There would be a massive government infrastructure program that will provide funds to local public school districts to repair, replace, or construct new state-of-the-art buildings and equip them with modern supplies. And that is for every public school district, but with a particular focus on public schools in underserved areas, poor areas, Black, Hispanic, Native American. Many of these school districts are desperate for state-of-the-art buildings, state-of-the-art equipment. I believe a massive government infrastructure program to do that would be a wonderful reparation. I would also institute the GI Bill for all, right? So during the Second World War, the GI Bill allowed service personnel to go and attend college. That then allowed them to earn higher wages, buy homes, do all the things that led to the American rebirth after the Second World War. Well, in the 21st century, this new GI Bill for all would expand that from military service, but to any kind of service to the community. So if you're in a rural area, you want to volunteer for your local volunteer fire department, you would be eligible for the GI Bill for all. If you're in an inner city community, you volunteer for a United Way agency or for the American Red Cross or any other qualified agency, or perhaps even a governmental agency for that matter, you would be eligible for the GI Bill. That would finance your college so that you can obtain a degree without carrying massive amounts of debt at the end of it, right? That would be a reparation. All right. Okay, healthcare. Well, I believe that a public option for all healthcare plans would be a wonderful reparation, right? The idea of the employee-based healthcare program, okay, that's fine. That could be retained, but there should be a public option, along that, so that we can, employees, especially those in volatile industries like many Blacks and Hispanics happen to be in, they can then take their health care from one industry to the next, or one job to the next. Also, I would, under the Obamacare law, there would be an expansion of Medicare coverage for the indigent for many of the states, Republican states mostly, that elected not to do that. And that would cover many more Blacks, Hispanics, and poor whites who really need healthcare coverage. Okay. And just like with the educational reparation, I would launch a massive investment in medical infrastructure in poverty-stricken areas, right? So here in Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, also inner city areas of Houston and Beaumont, Dallas and San Antonio, El Paso and other places would be eligible to receive massive amounts of stimulus money to rebuild their public clinics and hospitals, thus providing better health care to all their people. All right. Socially, socially, reparations to me look something like this. Confederate monuments would be removed from public spaces and returned to the organizations that commissioned them or to an appropriate historical group. Schools and military installations would be renamed if they are currently named for an officer or a politician that has been stripped of their commission by the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is already the law of the land, so you don't have to pass any new law to do that. These persons certainly should not have any kind of military or government building named after them if they have been court-martialed or stripped of their commission by an act of the government, right? And so that would be corrected, and that would be a reparation. Now, the most controversial of the reparations will probably be the economic reparations, right? So this is kind of what I had in mind as it relates to economic reparations. Okay, the government would launch a massive investment in apprenticeship programs in the inner city and impoverished areas. Corporations would boost recruitment in minority communities and establish mentorship programs for minority managers and executives. Right? Sounds completely reasonable to me. And that would be a reparation. Also, any contemporary company with a legacy of slave profiteering would contribute to a fund that would provide for a new freedom bank for the descendants of slaves. And their contribution would be matched by state governments that also had legalized slavery, right? And would also be matched by the federal government, Now, this new Freedom Bank would be based on the original Freedmen's Bank from after the Civil War. Now, that particular bank had an unfortunate end, but we now know what it would take to operate a Freedom Bank properly, right? And by being seeded with the seed money from the descendants of the companies that profiteered from slaves, it could be an opportunity to set up an entrepreneurship program and funding in those communities for the descendants of those slaves. So those are my ideas on reparations. And in an upcoming video, I'll talk about the opposition to it and what is it based on. Well, a lot of it is based, well, it's psychology, and we'll get to that in the next video. But I really hope you found this video interesting. I hope that you learned something. Please let me know what you think in the comment section. I would really appreciate it. And thank you and good luck.